Snow whispered against the barbed wire as dawn crept over the camp. Rows of women, once Wehrmacht auxiliaries, now prisoners, stood motionless, their breath fogging the frozen air. Torn coats, mud, caked boots, hollow eyes. A guard barked a number and the line shuffled forward. They weren't soldiers anymore, just ghosts, with uniforms still clinging to their bones. In early 1945, this Soviet transit camp near Lodz, Poland, held nearly 900 women captured during the Eastern Front collapse. Reports indicate over 900 German women were detained across the Soviet zone that year. Within months, more than a third died, malnutrition, typhus, exposure. Death here wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, bureaucratic. The war was over, yet it kept feeding. A steel bucket overturned. Someone whispered, "Water." No one moved. The guards had learned that thirst made silence easier to maintain. Every sound echoed: boots on gravel, a gate creak, the cough of a dying girl. From the watchtower, a Soviet sergeant spat and muttered, "Even the snow pities them." Below, one German woman pressed a photograph to her chest. Her son, age 4, last seen when Berlin still had streetlights. Her fingers bled where she'd torn her ration card to wrap the picture. "We were trained to fear them," one Red Army private would later write. "But here, they just stared at us like we'd already died." That line from his diary captures the cognitive dissonance of that morning. Conquerors watching the conquered dissolve into something beyond hate, beyond victory. The camp's wooden barracks exhaled smoke and rot. Somewhere, a kettle whined on a stove. Steam drifted through the cold, carrying the faintest smell of cabbage, almost food, almost hope. The guards didn't notice when a small figure in a medic's coat crossed the yard, holding that kettle with both hands. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to look at them, but she did. The women lifted their heads for the first time in days, following the steam trail as it moved closer. One of them whispered, "An angel." Another whispered back, "No." Soviet. Boots stopped. The kettle wobbled. The young Soviet medic looked at their faces, trembling but steady enough to speak, and with a voice barely above the wind, she said, "Don't cry, please." Next came the moment no one understood at first, when mercy broke the silence. The steam curled through the air like a living thing. Every pair of hollow eyes followed it as the young Soviet medic stepped closer, clutching her dented kettle. Her breath trembled in the cold. Her boots were too large, her uniform stained with iodine and smoke. Yet her words, soft, fragile, impossible, hung over the yard. "Don't cry, please." No one moved. The guards stared. For a heartbeat, the war itself seemed to pause. The German women, once radio operators, nurses, typists of the Third Reich, didn't know whether to laugh or collapse. They hadn't heard kindness in months. The medic lowered the kettle onto a crate and began pouring thin cabbage broth into chipped tin cups. The smell of salt and wilted greens filled the air, barely food, yet intoxicating after endless hunger. Reports from camp archives record 700 calories a day, mostly black bread, moldy potatoes, and water thick with ash. Starvation wasn't punishment, it was policy. But that morning the ration line shifted. One woman hesitated to step forward, convinced it was a trick. Another covered her mouth, sobbing soundlessly. The medic looked up, eyes red, rimmed from sleeplessness. "Eat," she said quietly in broken German. "Bitte essen." The guards didn't stop her. Maybe they didn't dare. Maybe they were tired of being monsters. Her voice, one prisoner later recalled, was the first human sound in months. She moved from face to face, refilling cups, ignoring the frostbite on her own fingers. The women whispered prayers they no longer believed in. The broth steamed, hands shook, tears froze. Somewhere, a harmonica played from the barracks, weak notes carried on the wind, as if testing whether the world still allowed music. That morning's small act shouldn't have mattered, yet in war's machinery, even a single human gesture could jam the gears. The medic's voice cracked as she repeated it again and again, "Don't cry, please." By nightfall, the camp was different. A hush of confusion replaced the usual moans. Guards glanced uneasily at each other, as if compassion itself might be contagious. One woman kept whispering the words in her sleep, clutching her tin cup like a relic. No one knew it yet, but those 3 words would ripple through the camp, travelling faster than orders, faster than fear, until even the walls seemed to listen. And by morning, frost would carry that echo to every barrack door. By dawn, the rumour had mutated into something almost mythical. The phrase, "Don't cry, please," slipped from mouth to mouth like contraband, carried on breath clouds and whispers between bunk planks. Some said she mocked them, others swore she meant it. No one could agree, and that uncertainty burned hotter than hunger. The frost was brutal that morning. Wind scraped across the yard, cutting through coats already stiff with sweat and salt. A woman named Ilse refused her ration, clutching the bread like a weapon. "They want to see us beg," she hissed. Next to her, another prisoner, barely 18, broke down, sobbing until her tears froze on her cheeks. The guards watched with the dull indifference of men long emptied of empathy. Reports estimate temperatures that week dropped to 15 degrees C, with frostbite affecting nearly 40% of the camp's inmates. Hands turned blue, nails blackened, flesh split open without blood. The medic returned anyway, her breath fogging through the scarf tied around her face. She carried no food this time, only strips of linen and a tin basin filled with melted snow. The women recoiled at first. A German POW instinct was suspicion. Kindness had always come with a price, but she said nothing, only knelt before the one who'd refused bread, washed her blistered feet and wrapped them gently. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. We didn't know what to think. A survivor later wrote, "She didn't shout, she didn't laugh, she looked sorry for us." That word sorry had vanished from their vocabulary months ago. Yet in that moment, it felt like oxygen returning to a dying body. The guard nearest the gate turned his head away. The medic kept working, her fingers raw, her expression unreadable. Behind her, the sky cracked open with weak light, reflecting off the frost like shattered glass. By evening, a strange calm settled over the barracks. No fights, no screaming, just the soft rustle of bandages and the faint scent of disinfectant. Compassion had entered the camp, and no one knew how to process it. As night fell, one prisoner whispered, "She'll be punished." Another answered, "Then so will we." When the sun rose again, the kettle was gone, but the medic wasn't. She came back carrying something else entirely. This time it wasn't soup. It was hope wrapped in gauze. She arrived before sunrise, her silhouette barely visible through the steam of the camp kitchens. No kettle this time, just a small wooden crate clinking with bottles and torn strips of cloth. The wind howled through the gaps in the barrack walls, carrying the smell of sweat, iodine, and something older, fear that had lost its edge. The medic moved from bunk to bunk, wordless. The women froze, unsure whether to shrink or reach out. She didn't ask names, didn't speak commands. Instead, she hummed softly, a tune that didn't belong in war. Later, one prisoner identified it as a Russian lullaby, something about snow and lost children. The sound was almost unbearable in its gentleness. Hands cracked from cold, feet swollen from frostbite, skin crawling with lice. She touched each with careful, methodical precision. Her gloves were gone. She used bare fingers, wiping pus and dirt away with snow, melt. She cleaned us like she was washing shame off. One German clerk recalled decades later. Records from Soviet infirmaries show staggering numbers. By early 1946, over 10 zero women per month cycled through makeshift field hospitals like this one. Some were treated only to be sent back to labor the next day. Others never returned. Yet here, in this forgotten corner of Poland, one medic refused to let pain stay anonymous. One night, as she stitched a wound on a woman's arm, the patient whispered, "Why help us?" The medic looked up. For a heartbeat she almost smiled, because rules don't heal, she said quietly. The words spread faster than infection. By morning, the barrack was alive with whispers not of escape or revolt, but of her. She's different. She listens. She hums when she works. For women trained to obey, silence had been safety. Now silence became unbearable. Outside, guards muttered about discipline slipping. The nurse spends too much time with them, one reported, another shrugged, let her, they're already half dead, but not everyone agreed. The commandant's office window stayed lit long into the night, cigarette smoke curling through the cracks. Inside, someone was writing her name on a report, unauthorized contact with prisoners, and when dawn came again, her bunk was empty. The women knew instantly, kindness had a cost. The next sound they heard was the iron latch of the punishment cell opening. The clang of the iron door silenced the yard. The medic stood between two guards, her cap gone, her hair stiff with frost. Around her, the camp held its breath. She didn't resist as they marched her past the lines of women she'd treated, those same faces now pale with terror. The kettle, the gauze, the lullaby all vanished into memory the moment that lock clicked. Inside the commandant's office, smoke coiled through the air like accusation. A single bulb swung overhead, casting sharp shadows on a desk cluttered with reports. He didn't look up right away. "You wasted medicine," he said finally, voice cold as the floor beneath her boots. On enemies. She didn't answer. Her gloves still smelled of iodine and rot. Official Soviet camp directives labeled empathy toward fascists as disciplinary sabotage. There were cells reserved for that, a concrete cube where cold did the interrogating. Later archives mention short-term isolation for medical non-compliance. The euphemism meant 3 days without heat, food, or sound. The women gathered outside, pretending to shovel snow so they could glance toward the block. The frostbitten one she'd bandaged whispered, "She'll die there." Another murmured, "Maybe that's mercy." The guards, uneasy, kept their distance. One of them, a young conscript missing 2 fingers, spat in the snow and muttered, "Orders are orders." But his eyes didn't match his tone. That night, no one in the barracks slept. They listened for footsteps, for a scream, for anything that confirmed she was still human. Instead, they heard wind against the tin roof and the steady groan of ice forming on the window frames. "We watched her walk away," one prisoner wrote later, "and it felt like losing light. By the 3rd day, the commandant called her out again. Her lips were cracked, her voice gone. Still, when she passed the women's row, she lifted her eyes just once. Not defiant, not broken, just a present. Something shifted after that. Guards began to glance over their shoulders before striking. Rations lingered longer before being snatched away. The cruelty didn't end, but it hesitated. It was as if her silence had infected them with doubt. And in that infection, rebellion began not with fire or shouting, but with a crust of bread passed hand to hand under the cover of darkness. It began so subtly that no one could tell when mercy turned into defiance. The first sign came one evening when a Red Army guard, broad-shouldered, face chiseled by frost, tossed a crust of rye bread into the snow near the barracks. No words, no eye contact, just a casual flick of the wrist as if dropping guilt itself. Then another guard followed. A half-cigarette, still warm from his lips. It rolled toward a woman huddled near the gate. She stared at it like a miracle before hiding it under her sleeve. Humanity had started leaking through the cracks of discipline. Reports from declassified archives show Red Army losses reached 11 million soldiers by war's end, an entire generation buried or broken. The men stationed here weren't villains. They were survivors too, carrying trauma like invisible shrapnel. Maybe that's why they couldn't look away from the German women anymore. Their rage was exhausted. We had lost too much to keep hating forever. One former Soviet sentry confessed years later. Sometimes, giving a piece of bread felt like revenge against death itself. At night, whispers replaced the usual coughs and cries. "The medic is still alive," someone murmured. They say she smiled at the guards. The rumor alone was oxygen. Even the snow seemed less sharp against their faces. Inside the camp's tool shed, A worker found a small scrap of paper handwritten Cyrillic tucked into a shovel handle. The translation read, "You are not forgotten." No one knew who wrote it, but everyone decided to believe it came from her. For the first time, the line between captor and captive blurred. A cigarette shared during night watch. A ladle of soup filled an inch higher than regulation. Tiny acts of treason disguised as decency. The commandant felt it too. His tone sharpened during roll call, his orders barked louder, but discipline shouted loudest when it was losing control. Still, in a place built to erase humanity, small gestures became insurgent. A guard adjusted a blanket instead of tearing it away. Another turned his back while two women filled their pockets with potato peelings. The rebellion wasn't loud. It didn't wave flags. It breathed quietly, steady as frost, waiting for the next tremor because deep inside the radio hut, a teletype machine was clattering with new orders from Moscow. And this time the war was changing shape again. The order came stamped in red wax and wrapped in the chill of authority. The guards read it aloud under the grey morning sky. All German female prisoners will be assigned to literacy classes and work brigades. Re-education to commence immediately. The words hung in the air like smoke from a new kind of weapon, ideological this time, not steel. The camp's frozen silence cracked open. The shovels were replaced with notebooks. The women stared blankly at them, unsure which was heavier. In 1947, Soviet archives list more than 200 camps converted from punishment sites to rehabilitation zones. The goal wasn't revenge now, it was reconstruction. But for those who'd known nothing but command and submission, education felt like another form of captivity. We didn't know whether to fear the book or the shovel. One survivor said, "Inside the barracks, chalkboards were nailed to walls still damp with mold. Broken pencils were rationed like sugar. A portrait of Stalin replaced the Red Cross banner. The guards now walked with books tucked under their arms, pretending authority could be rewritten." Then she returned. The medic, thinner now, her face lined from cold and confinement, walked back into the yard wearing a faded arm, and marked with a red star and the word instructor. She was no longer a nurse, she was a teacher. The women froze. For weeks they had whispered about her punishment, imagined her buried in the frozen ground. Yet here she was alive and somehow unchanged. Her first lesson was simple. She drew the Cyrillic alphabet on a plank painted black with coal dust. The women repeated each letter in hesitant unison, their voices hoarse but synchronized like a broken choir. Outside, the commandant watched, hands clasped behind his back. He believed he'd turned compassion into propaganda. But inside that room, something else was happening, a transfer of dignity disguised as education. When one woman failed to pronounce a word, the medic didn't scold her. She simply smiled and said, "Try again." That smile carried more rebellion than any rifle. By dusk, the snow outside had started melting in thin streaks down the windowpane. The women wrote their first Russian words, their letters uneven but determined. And as one of them looked up at the medic, she realized this wasn't re-education. It was resurrection in disguise. The classroom smelled of wet wood and coal smoke. Every breath left a fog that hung in front of the women's faces like ghosts refusing to leave. The medic, now the instructor, stood at a plank board coated in coal dust, chalk stub pinched between her fingers. She wrote slowly, deliberately, "Ya yo sm yuri che yo lov ye ka." Then in halting German, "I am human." The room went still. For the first time, the prisoners repeated the phrase not as translation, but as declaration. The sentence scratched into their throats like fire. Most of them were under 25, according to camp rosters, former typists, clerks, auxiliary radio operators. They had taken orders, not formed thoughts, but now they traced Cyrillic letters with cracked fingers, their nails black from labor, their voices steadying with each repetition. Outside, wind rattled the tin roof, but inside that barrack a strange warmth gathered, an energy that wasn't supposed to exist in a place built for despair. She made us read Pushkin. A survivor later said, "We didn't understand the words, but the rhythm, it made us feel alive again." Each page of the tattered books was a battlefield. They struggled to pronounce the soft Russian vowels, laughing quietly when someone stumbled. Even laughter sounded dangerous, echoing like contraband. But the medic didn't stop them. Her own voice cracked when she read aloud, translating softly, "To love is to suffer wisely." It wasn't in the curriculum, but it became the only line they remembered. Reports show that in 1947 alone, tens of thousands of German POW attended these education brigades. Officially, the purpose was political cleansing. Unofficially, for many women, it became the first time they had the right to think. One day, a guard found a small notebook beneath a bunk, written in careful handwriting, half German, half Russian. It was a diary filled with sketches of faces, memories of Dresden, and fragments of poems copied from class. He didn't understand its meaning, but he sensed its danger. He handed it to the commandant, who frowned, then smiled. "So," he said, "they've learned to write again." By nightfall, soldiers searched every barrack, overturning straw mattresses and tearing up floorboards. The medic stood in the doorway, powerless as they seized the notebook. Her eyes followed it like one watches a candle snuffed out by wind. And she knew the war had just found a new language. The diary surfaced at dawn, laid flat on the commandant's desk beside an untouched tin of cigarettes. Its cover was soft leather, edges burned by candle smoke, pages swollen from moisture. A soldier had found it tucked inside a straw mattress. One careless secret, one confiscated voice. The commandant didn't shout, he smiled. He opened the book and began to read aloud in slow, accented German. The women were forced to line up outside his office, trembling in the cold as every sentence echoed through the open window. January 12th, the soup had worms again. February 3rd, I dreamed of my son's hands. March 2nd, I no longer fear dying, I fear forgetting how to speak. The women lowered their eyes. The medic stood nearby, motionless. Her own handwriting marked the margins, translations, notes, corrections. She had been helping them express what couldn't be said aloud. When the commandant reached the page about Dresden, the bombs, the firestorms, the smell of melting tar, he slammed the diary shut. Enough, his voice cracked like glass. Official Soviet accounts estimated 25,000 civilians had perished in that inferno. German records said even more. But here, statistics didn't matter. The diary wasn't about numbers. It was about memory refusing to obey. The commandant turned toward the medic, who taught them to write this. For the first time, she answered with something sharper than fear. "Truth isn't treason," she said. The room froze. A cigarette fell from a guard's hand. No one breathed. Later testimonies confirmed she wasn't punished that day. Maybe the commandant saw something in her eyes he couldn't confront. Or maybe he realized silencing one woman would make 100 remember harder. Still, the diary disappeared. No one saw it again, but that night, the medic's words spread like wildfire through the camp. "Truth isn't treason." The phrase whispered from bunk to bunk, repeated in the dark like prayer. For the women, it meant survival through story. For the guards, it meant doubt creeping into uniform seams. At roll call, no one dared speak her name. But the guards' hands shook when holding their rifles, because the next search order was already drafted. And this time they wouldn't just look for diaries, they'd search for hearts still capable of writing. They came in a crate marked inspection waste. Hundreds of envelopes, yellowed, water, stained, sealed for years. The Soviet censors had collected them like evidence of hope. Each carried the same fate, returned to sender. One evening, a storm tore through the camp, ripping shingles from the roof. Amid the chaos, the medic slipped into the records hut. She found the crate stacked under old forms and ration lists. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside letters in German, some in shaky childlike handwriting, others in neat script. Everyone unopened. She read the first line she saw. Mutty, when will you come home? I kept your shoes clean. That night, she smuggled a handful of letters into the barracks, hidden under her coat. She didn't hand them out directly. Instead, she gathered the women and began to read softly, translating sentence by sentence, her voice barely above the crackle of the stove. By Soviet policy, male censorship in POW zones exceeded 90% by 1948. Communication was control, silence was safety. But in that barrack, words became a kind of rebellion. One woman pressed her fists to her mouth, trying not to sob as she recognized her husband's handwriting. Another fainted when she heard the name of a town that no longer existed. The medic kept reading, her voice cracking with each translation. She wasn't just reading, one survivor wrote later. She was resurrecting the dead with her voice. Outside, the guards listened but didn't intervene. Some leaned closer to the window, drawn by the sound of emotions they'd buried in themselves. For a few minutes, the war outside their minds stopped echoing. When she finished, the medic placed the letters on the table like holy relics. These were meant for you, she said softly, and now they've arrived. The next morning, soldiers stormed the barrack, confiscating everything. The women watched as the crate was carried away again. Sealed, labeled, erased. But one letter stayed behind, wedged between two floorboards. The medic found it hours later, addressed not to a prisoner but to her. The handwriting was German. The postmark read, Berlin 1945. Her breath caught as she read the first line, If you ever survive this war, I owe you my life. And for the first time, the medic realized someone on the other side had remembered her too. The paper trembled in her hands, edges soft as ash. The letter was written in clean, practiced German, the kind used by doctors or officers. She read the first line again under her breath. To the Soviet medic who saved me at Stettin, February 1945. Her pulse quickened. Stettin, the name struck her like a blow. That was the city where she had pulled a wounded German surgeon from a burning field hospital before retreating with her unit. She had never known his name, only the sound he made when breathing through shrapnel. Now, his words lay before her. You treated me when your comrades wanted to finish me. I have not forgotten. If you are alive, I will find a way to return what I owe. The ink was faded, but the intent glowed through time. Outside, the camp's morning siren wailed, dragging everyone back into the present. The medic folded the letter and slipped it into her sleeve, but rumors had already started. Someone had seen her reading it. Someone told the guards, Soviet archives confirm over 3-0 correspondences flagged as fraternization between former enemies after the war. Each letter, no matter how innocent, was treated as sedition, a crime against ideology. That evening, the commandant's aide entered the barracks. Search, he ordered. Boots stomped across the floor. Straw flew. When they reached her bunk, they found the letter hidden beneath a piece of soap. He snatched it, scanning the German lines. His jaw tightened. You communicate with the enemy. She met his gaze. The enemy was dying. I helped him live. He didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed confusion, like a man staring at a reflection he didn't want to recognize. By midnight, the letter sat on the commandant's desk, next to a half-empty glass of vodka. He read it twice, sighed, then stamped it with a red seal, to be reported to Moscow, suspected emotional compromise. In the morning, the medic was summoned. As she stepped out into the yard, frost sparkled across the mud, and the prisoners watched from the windows. They didn't know what the letter said, only that it had come from the other side of memory, and when the door shut behind her, they understood. Words could still be bullets, just quieter ones. The interrogation room was small, thick with cigarette smoke and damp plaster. A single bulb flickered overhead, swinging slightly as if the building itself were breathing. The medic stood straight despite the cold creeping up through her boots. Across from her sat the commandant, face unreadable, coat unbuttoned, eyes heavy from sleepless nights. On the table lay the letter from Berlin, now stamped with a red warning seal. He tapped it once. This, he said, is betrayal. She said nothing. You saved an enemy, you received his gratitude, and you kept it hidden. His tone grew harsher. We bled for 5 years, and you call this mercy? Her hands didn't move. Her throat tightened, but her voice, when it came, was steady. Mercy isn't betrayal, it's survival. The guard by the door shifted, uncomfortable. In official reports, such confrontations were rare, but documents confirm that nearly 1 in 5 Soviet medics were disciplined or demoted for leniency toward the enemy. The war had ended, but compassion was still a crime. The commandant leaned forward. You think you can decide who deserves kindness? I already did, she replied. Silence, only the light buzzed. For a second his face cracked, not anger but fatigue. He had seen too many corpses, too much obedience. Maybe her defiance reminded him of the man he used to be. He stood abruptly. You'll remain under observation, he muttered. No more teaching, no more contact with prisoners. 2 guards escorted her out, their boots echoing down the corridor. She didn't look back. Outside, the snow had turned to sleet, beating against the tin roofs. The women watched through the cracks in the walls as she was led away again. No one dared to speak, yet in their silence something unspoken passed between them, the understanding that she had chosen conviction over comfort. We thought she'd never come back, a survivor wrote years later, but knowing she refused to bow, that kept us alive more than the bread ever did. That night the barracks buzzed with rumors. Some said she'd be transferred, others whispered execution. No one knew the truth. Then, before dawn, a horn sounded across the camp. Orders came down from Moscow sudden, absolute. The camp was to be dismantled. And when morning broke, everything began to move again. The orders came fast, as if Moscow wanted the memory erased overnight. Trucks groaned through the mud, guards shouted lists of names, and for the first time in years, the gates opened. The women stared at the horizon, beyond the wire, like prisoners of light, unsure whether to move. The commandant's voice cracked through a loudspeaker. Prepare for repatriation. Columns form at dawn. They gathered what little they had, threadbare coats, scraps of letters, fragments of identity. For most, home was just a rumor. Their cities had been bombed into maps of dust. But walking west still meant something. It meant ending the sentence. The medic stood near the gate, clipboard in hand, now stripped of her title. No armband, no rank, just her eyes calm and watchful. The women filed past her, heads bowed. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone steadied their trembling steps. Reports estimate that by 1950, over 90% of German female POW were repatriated. Many never received compensation or even acknowledgement of captivity. But for those who survived, that march home was the moment they truly became human again. The road was endless mud and fog. Some women sang quietly old folk songs from the Rhineland. Others limped in silence, their feet wrapped in rags. A few collapsed and were lifted by those behind them. No one was left behind this time. A guard offered a cigarette to one of the older prisoners. She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, lighting it with shaking hands. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into mist. 2 enemies sharing breath instead of bullets. From the gate, the medic watched until the last column disappeared into the haze. We didn't wave goodbye. One survivor later wrote. We saluted. Behind her, the camp stood empty, doors swinging in the wind, a skeleton of a place that had tried to erase empathy and failed. She turned back once, looking at the barracks where she'd first said those impossible words. Don't cry, please. The phrase still echoed faintly, carried by wind through the broken roofs. Years later, survivors would write about that moment, the silence heavier than any anthem, the ground trembling under their boots as they stepped back into history. And in that silence, somewhere far away, the medic's story refused to end. 2 decades later, in a quiet hall in Hamburg, the past walked in without uniforms. The year was 1965. The war was history now, printed in textbooks and blurred photographs. But for the women who gathered there, it was still breathing beneath their ribs. They came with canes and scars, some wearing small brooches shaped like red crosses. A banner hung above the stage, reunion of Eastern POW survivors. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain. Conversations faltered, tears fell easily. Then someone whispered a phrase, just 3 words, "Don't cry, please." The room fell silent. Heads turned, and suddenly everyone remembered the snow, the hunger, the girl with trembling hands and a kettle of steam. The medic, the one who had dared to say something human when humanity was forbidden. Records suggest fewer than 0 women from that particular camp were still alive by 1965. But in that hall, it felt as if all of them were. They stood, one by one, repeating the words softly, half prayer, half promise. One survivor read from her diary. She said it only once, but every winter since I've heard it again. Another added, that voice built something inside us the war couldn't destroy. Photographs were passed around, grainy faces, a line of snow, a kettle steaming in midair. No one ever found out what became of the medic. Some said she was transferred east, others that she died during an epidemic. But for the women she saved, her memory was proof that compassion could outlive nations. We realized, a survivor said through tears, her mercy was stronger than victory. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows like distant footsteps fading into the past. Inside, silence stretched gentle, unbroken, the kind that used to mean fear but now meant peace. They ended the gathering not with applause, but with quiet smiles. Each woman placed a single white flower by a candle at the front of the hall. The flame flickered, mirrored in their eyes, steady against the dark. History often remembers wars by battles and generals, but sometimes history survives through a single sentence. Because in a frozen camp in 1945, one woman had changed the course of memory, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by saying softly, "Don't cry, please."